Mute yourself. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. This is another Meet the Gurus. Pleasure to have you all here. As many of you know, we're dedicated to technology, business, and entrepreneurship, and how these fields have converged and merged in so many ways. We're dedicated to spreading ideas, knowledge, and education. And today's Meet the Gurus is with Daniel Stinchcomb. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey Paul, thanks for having me on your podcast. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's and you're touching on a topic today about Azure and security that is probably top of mind for everyone. There have been various data breaches that are well known, not necessarily particular to Azure. But before we get into all of the nuances and the details, which I think most people are very interested in, not just the big strategic ideas, tell me a little about how you got into the field of technology and why Azure and why the cloud, I guess, in particular.
So I started off my journey as a young wee help desk lad, and just kind of progressed naturally through being a systems administrator, eventually going into engineering. At one point, I found myself in database administration, and it was that point that I learned all the complexities and horrors of securing data and compliance. And so, from my entire career, I've always worn multiple hats. So it eventually lended well to becoming an infrastructure architect, and companies being interested in the cloud made it so my architect days were spent moving things into specifically Azure. And so that's kind of where I got my start with Azure, and just having been mostly a part of the Microsoft ecosystem with SQL Server and Windows Server throughout most of my career, Azure seemed like a natural fit for me. I'm still well versed in AWS. I'm learning Google Cloud, but Azure is just where my bread and butter has always existed. So,
Yep.
specifically with security, though, security is always at the forefront of most database administrators' minds, and so it always seemed like a natural next step for me, because
Right.
I lost many nights of sleep wondering if my data was secure and who has access to it and how that data could potentially be unleashed upon the internet. I mean, you work in databases and you realize how easy it is to gain access to sensitive information, steal it, and how many companies aren't really taking some very basic but necessary precautions. And you start to wonder exactly how much of your data is actually out there, and the company doesn't even know it yet.
And a lot of what you've done, career-wise, not only been in the tech side, but in the finance and or the banking side, in terms of that kind of information. It's not just whether or not someone watched one movie or another on their in the database that you're tracking. You're tracking their money. You're tracking their PII, and in those databases. So obviously, as you know, there's both the internal and external exposures of that. So let's talk a little about Azure, what you like about it. What are some of the issues? Obviously, we're going to talk about some of those issues, but let's just start about what are the real positives in addition to its acceptance within the global enterprise.
Yeah, so I mean, Azure's Microsoft specifically has just been doing a fantastic job of playing catch up to Amazon in the cloud space over the past few years. I mean, obviously, Amazon is just a dominator in the cloud space. Most people's initial thoughts when they think cloud technologies are usually veering around AWS. Microsoft is starting to really kind of gain that, ground in that area, mostly because they've been doing a fantastic job of trying to say, we were weak on this in the past, and we're going to fix that moving forward. And security is definitely one of those areas where they've done a fantastic job of, you know, making up for lost time. You used to be able to say that Windows was probably one of the more vulnerable operating systems out there, but I think I forget what report it is, and I'll be happy to look it up and provide a link. Just so that I can source my information. But Apple actually, I think, just came out with a report where iOS actually has more malware attacks coming against it these days than Windows does.
Interesting.
And so that's a really interesting change you see kind of happening in the market, where it used to be people would buy Apple just because out of the box it claimed to be secure, and now people are targeting iOS because people are too comfortable in minimal security.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I like Microsoft. Is Microsoft, any company can get a little bit too big for its britches, but I think Azure specifically is doing a good job of constantly trying to evolve its posture with security, with usability.
Hmm.
I know Microsoft has been really, really rushing towards two specific models that I'm really a big fan of, and that's more of a zero trust model, and also on a less security focused, the low code programming with things like their Power Platform.
Hmm.
I think those are two things that are really kind of changing the shape of the industry specific to cloud technologies and development, and how businesses can start building their own platform and securing their own platform using native tools.
Do you think that, I mean, it's kind of interesting because years back, long time ago, when we started using cloud tech, we as a company and others started using cloud technologies. I mean, AWS obviously was at the forefront, but it was also like navigating or flying a rocket ship, right? It wasn't exactly like this was very intuitive, but it required a lot of expertise. If you were to contrast the two, or let's just use those as an example because those are your areas of expertise in particular, how would you, because my view of it, again, not being the technologist, is that AWS is just a lot harder to learn at the get-go. Is that a fair statement, or do you think that they're pretty much on a par in terms of their...
No, I mean, so here's the thing. I mean, if I mean, for my, I think it's more of an opinion-based thing. I know a lot of people who would be happy to argue with us until they're blue in the face that AWS is just as easy to approach as Azure. Some people would say easier. I think it's realistically just wherever you get your start. Ultimately, AWS, I think its console is very approachable. It's a little bit, it's not quite as usable in the context of Azure, where you have like application dashboards where you can look at all your resources in use at a glance. But at the end of the day, AWS does have some things that have been a little bit more streamlined because AWS is more mature as a cloud platform. So I feel like it's just kind of a give and take. You'll always be able to find those things that you can nitpick with any cloud platform. And at the end of the day, it's more what you're comfortable with. I mean, most of the administrators that I know that are using Azure are mostly in things like the Azure CLI, using PowerShell to manage their environments, deploying with infrastructure as code through things like Terraform or native Azure Resource Manager. And it's kind of the same with AWS. You dive into it and you start seeing people using things like CloudFormation to deploy their resources, using more serverless technologies like Azure Functions or AWS Lambda. And these things take development skills. They take the ability to deploy from remote locations from your laptop using tools like Visual Studio or, maybe something like Eclipse or something of that nature. And it's not necessarily one is easier to use than the other. It's more just where do you have your feet wet?
Right. And presumably also who employs you and what cloud strategies they have, because obviously many are hybrid cloud organizations, I would say. Let's talk about. I'm holding a list that I've found of the top 20 Azure vulnerabilities. I don't know if this is a Dave Letterman top 10 or a Paul Siegel top 20, but why don't you talk through some of these? I've shared obviously these with you. You know them backwards and forwards. We talk about some of this stored account accessibility, how things are sort of configured out of the box in Azure, and how it potentially presents vulnerabilities if you don't sort of tick some of the early boxes of what you should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most important things to realize whenever you're deploying to something like Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, you're using Alibaba, IBM. I don't care if you're using something smaller like Rackspace. The bottom line is understanding what you're opening up to with any service. So let's take, for example, number one on your list: storage accounts accessible from the internet. Storage accounts in Azure, specifically, when you deploy a storage account, Azure is going to do its best possible effort to get that to be secure from the get-go. And as you're going through, if you're deploying through the GUI, as you're deploying it, it's going to warn you, hey, this is accessible from the public-facing internet. Like, you got to make sure that you're securing this, and you need to listen to those warnings, because it's just like with S3 buckets in AWS. One of the biggest issues that companies have is they leave these things able to be accessed from any location. They don't have proper authentication structures put onto the storage account, and this leads to people just doing scans across different domains, and they find a vulnerable spot. They scratch at it, they find a way in, and then suddenly whatever's in that storage container is suddenly free access, because they're going to take everything they can. They're going to post that this is vulnerable, and you're going to see, it's one of the ways that a breach can happen. Now, luckily, Microsoft I don't know if AWS is doing it. I'm pretty sure they are, where they raise a flag. Like I said, they'll try to make it so that this is at least at a baseline security level where you're going to make sure that that storage account has some type of authentication necessary to access it. You're going to need to access it from a specific IP or IP range. Um, there are things that you can require in accessing that storage account. And, this is also something that you need to do inside your environments as well. In Azure, when you're deploying a network for the first time, if you're not bothering to set up network security groups or private links or service links to your domains inside the virtual network you set up, you're making it so that everything in your Azure environment can talk to each other, and that can cause internal issues. If someone were to manage to get inside a virtual machine you have on your virtual network and you have made it so that virtual machine can talk to everything, and you feel like it's just safe because it's in Azure, no one can access that, right?
Right.
Well, unfortunately, if a threat actor were to get access to that machine, they could then poke around anything that you haven't bothered to secure traffic to. So it doesn't end at authentication and making sure that people can authorize themselves. It's a matter of making sure that communication is secure as well, and that applies to everything.
And that also transferring data within across machines, right? Across machines within a specific environment across the organization, and how it's been architected. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line is, threat actors can get information a variety of ways. Grabbing insecure communications is definitely one of those ways that you got to watch out for. Luckily, most communication through Azure is by default encrypted. So being able to do something like a packet capture inside Azure is going to be a lot more difficult than if, say, someone's internal network wasn't using encryption by default. So I think in that regard, Azure is okay for internal secure transmission. The biggest thing you're looking for internal communications inside of Azure is just making sure that those routes are just not touching anything they shouldn't. So if you have a domain that's specific for your management workloads, you have a domain that's specific for your workloads, you have a domain that's specific for your data, you're making sure that the only thing that can access those subdomains, and even getting more nitpicky is getting into those specific machines, are only the things that need that access.
Right.
So if you have a web application on the front end and it needs access to an application server in your workload tier and a database server on your data tier, it can only communicate to those specific machines or any load balancer you may have in front of them, making sure that your communication channels are not only secure based off of Microsoft's encryption that they provide for that communication, but also making sure that those communications can't go anywhere else but those machines.
Right. And to what extent does multi-factor authentication solve some of the problems reduce the risks? I mean, is it and is it to zero, or what level of comfort do you have that multi-factor authentication has solved some of these problems?
So I'll definitely say, just kind of right out the door, there's no such thing as zero risk. Anybody who believes in zero risk in technology, you're asking for trouble, because threat actors are evolving way faster than we can deal with it a lot of times. And so multi-factor authentication does a great job of reducing user authentication risk, because what you're doing is you're making it so that a user needs to have either something on them, something that can, whether it be their phone, getting a text message or an email, it requires that second layer that usually the user only has access to. And so it helps. It makes it so that once the user's initiated that initial authentication process, the system can kick back and say, hey, are we sure this is the user? And the best part is Azure specifically makes it so that you can set policies around that as well. So let's say that you have a company of about 500 users, and they all just keep pissing and moaning that they don't want to have to use MFA every single time they log in. Well, you can do yourself a favor and just say, hey, let's just go ahead and whitelist our employees as long as they're specifically coming from our IP address. So say your company's natting out your IP address, as most companies do. And so if Microsoft sees the authentication attempt coming from that IP, it can say, okay, we can whitelist that IP and we can allow this to bypass MFA. Now, that's not always a solution, because obviously IPs can be spoofed. But at the same time, it is just one of those things where you can do to alleviate some strain on your users, because I don't know about you, but I don't always like getting challenged for an MFA passcode or having to always authorize myself every single time I log in.
Right.
Yeah, but it's just
No, go
Sorry, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say that's often the case. It gets frustrating, but at the same time, it also seems to me that sometimes the multi-factor authentication is overdone because it's on an application that you wouldn't think needs security at that level. For example, I mean, just an example. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but something like Mailchimp
Mhm.
requires multi-factor authentication, and yes, I suppose that could compromise your email lists, but it's not exactly like you're compromising your bank information or your insurance information or your social security information.
So it's true, but I mean, at the same time, it's also about saving face with your client lists.
Right.
If someone were to get access to your client list, they know that they're a student at Starweaver or a subscriber to something. You want is someone posing as Starweaver to that contact list and trying to you know uh, perform fraudulent activities, get people to sign up for things. Maybe they try to deface your company in some way by using that email list against you. It's not just about user security; it's about company security as well. You want to make sure that you maintain a good name. You want to make sure that your data is safe in all regards. And, data is data. And we are a data driven society now. I mean,
Right.
so we should be doing everything we can to secure any data that is in any way valuable. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
my name, Daniel Stinchcomb, is public record.
Right.
I could really care less if a threat actor gets my name because they could get that off of any of the videos that I do. They could do it
Correct.
off of my LinkedIn profile. What I don't want them to have is, access to a list of places that I may be a customer at
Right.
or I may be subscribed to because that gives them information about me that they could use to social engineer. And that's another danger to any company is social engineering. So any data that could potentially be used in a escalated manner is not something you want to get out there easily. It's
Right.
just a matter of making best effort.
No, so it's a great point. It's actually a great point. Well taken also. So let's go through some of these other top 20 lists that are out there. I don't know. Let's jump down to number 7, unencrypted OS and data disks. Talk about that on some level, and maybe that's not top priority for you. But what do you think about that?
No, I actually, I'll be one of those people who will preach encryption of your data at rest until I'm blue in the face. Um, Encryption costs so very little these days to do at an at-rest scenario. Encrypting your OS and your data disks is something that you should be doing just as a baseline, simply because you're making it so that if anybody were to get a copy, especially with data disks being virtual now, if anybody were to be able to pull a copy of that data drive, suddenly they've got an entire drive's worth of data that you've left unencrypted. And who knows how much data could be on that disk? If it's a database disk, oh man, that's going to be a bad day. If it's an application disk, you could be pulling API data, you could be pulling cache, which threat actors can get a lot of information off of that. On the OS level, it wouldn't be hard to potentially pull an OS disk and delete the old one, hold it as a different type of ransomware. I mean, on the OS level, it depends on what you're storing there. An OS disk is just probably going to make your day harder, but it's still time lost and money spent.
Yeah. No,
Um,
it's well taken. Again, I think that's probably an area of that many people don't think about, right? Because it's not as dynamic. It's not always being touched.
and most cloud platforms these days are pretty much making disk encryption a default. Uh, I'm pretty sure you'd have to argue with an Azure support tech to get a disk unencrypted because
Mm-hmm.
they do their own managed service key on every disk that you provision.
Mm-hmm.
You can enable a customer managed key if you like, so that you can manage your keys either for compliance reasons or if you maybe have a slightly stricter security model than Microsoft does, and you just want to make sure that those keys are getting rotated properly. That's up to you. Maybe you have an HSM you're using that you like to manage keys through. There's a lot of good reasons to use a customer managed key, but Microsoft, I know for a fact, is encrypting things by default, and I'm pretty sure AWS and GCP are doing that as well.
What about email notifications that either have not been configured or not running on the security center, and logs that are not necessarily being trapped
So when it,
in activity?
yeah, so I mean, when it comes to email, you're pretty much just denying yourself the ability to respond to events in any regard. That's not just with Microsoft Security Center, that's also with Azure Monitor. You want to make sure that you're getting notified when there's a problem. There's really no sense in having an alert configured if you don't have an email for it to go to. As far as log analytics goes, Microsoft makes it so that you can secure 500 megabytes of security data per machine per day. And that's free. Anything beyond that, you start getting charged, but it's a pretty negligible cost. It's pennies on the dollar. And the bottom line is, you can't. I really wish more companies would start embracing the idea of you can't really put a good price on security. You kind of just want to do your best effort to make sure that your customers and yourself are secure. And so Microsoft and AWS and GCP and most companies these days are trying to make security really approachable. They're trying to make it as affordable as possible. I mean, of course, you can spend hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars on security, and you can still get breached at the end of the day spending that money, but at least you can say you made your best effort to protect your employees, your clients, anything that is potentially valuable in that company. And so doing things like enabling basic security, logging in, specifically in Azure, it's a button, it's a check mark that you do either during provisioning, or if you don't do it during provisioning, you can do it after the fact by just going under your settings, going under diagnostics, put all your diagnostic logs into Azure Monitor, put all your security logs into log analytics, and you now have data that you can use to backtrack events. You can, if you don't configure emails to be able to backtrack events, you're going to be a lot more reactive than you would be if you could be more proactive on something where you get notified where there's been several bad logon attempts, or maybe a machine's performing higher than normal and you need to go check that out.
Right.
It's absolutely critical that you get notified.
Right.
So you can't just leave those email settings, you can't just leave those logs unconfigured, because you're just cheating yourself out of data that you can use to respond to that event.
And is that how they're delivered out of the box when you set it up? There's no real preset reminders and thresholds for attacks of any sort that you'd be notified about?
So Microsoft Microsoft at least tries to make it so that it's not going to spam you out of the box with a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily need. I mean, it has recommendations that it can use. The moment that you enable the Azure Security Center, you're pretty much given recommendations across the board, but Microsoft still isn't going to send you 3,000 emails about what those recommendations may be. It's more focused on making it so that you can tailor things to what you need to know about. Because if a CPU is performing at above 60% capacity, that may be normal for your application. It may be a very CPU driven or RAM driven or even disk driven operation that you're just used to seeing happen. Right. You don't need emails about that. But if you start to see that CPU spiked like 95, 100%, it's pretty consistent, you need to look at that. Yeah, you can put in custom responses where if you think it's just a load issue, you can make it so that it scales automatically, but you'll probably still want to go check to make sure everything's on the up and up. For authentication attempts, though, if there's 6 authentication attempts and they've all failed, you may want to log in, take a look, see where those authentication attempts are coming from, and you're not going to be able to know that if you're not logging.
What about the monitoring policies, and are those also sort of preset, and do you construct them as you in Security Center, Azure Security Center?
So for monitoring policies, you're going to actually head over to Azure Monitor to configure a lot of that. Azure Security Center is more, at the free tier, is more recommendation based. It's going to scan your environment. It's going to give you recommendations of what you can do, like enabling just-in-time access, making sure that you have some of those monitors in place, making sure that your disks are, making sure that you've configured your disks to, access to your disks, or looking at your storage accounts and making sure that they're not open for a free-for-all on the internet. On Azure Monitor is where you're going to configure more of those performance-based alerts, where you're going to have it take in more of that diagnostic data and respond to alerts based off of thresholds that you decide, rather than anything Microsoft recommends. Because yes, it has baselines, it has recommendations, but again, Microsoft's goal isn't to bombard you with 1,000 emails and make you tune it back like some other monitoring softwares may do. Microsoft's goal is to make it so that you jump in and you configure it. And that's the whole point of making sure that whoever's in your cloud is trained in the cloud. Probably, one thing that hasn't made this list that I really need to emphasize to everybody is making sure that if you're going to put people in charge of your cloud environments, you have to have them trained in your cloud environments. No cloud structure is in any way like a traditional infrastructure. Just like with this monitoring, it's not going to immediately notify you out of the box when there's a problem if you haven't configured it. And that's important to know. But it's also important to know how to configure these things without making a giant bill. I can't tell you the number of times I've had to have arguments with people who had a very traditional infrastructure mindset, and they refused to believe that the cloud actually offered a sometimes better but ultimately different solution, and we had to work with that because so many people are stuck in this old kind of, I don't want to say draconian, but it kind of is these days,
Right.
mindset of, oh, we need to do it the same way we've always done it on premise. And that's honestly probably one of the more dangerous mindsets in cloud technology.
Is not thinking like you're on the cloud.
Right. It's very code based now. It's very, configure what you need based. It doesn't offer every single feature out of the box because they're trying to make it so that your total cost of ownership can be lower than investing in server infrastructure,
Right.
buying 3 or 4 years of service for an application.
Right.
They're trying to make it so that you pay for what you need so that your bill doesn't get extravagant.
Right. But then you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So you're
And
you're stuck with, well, not stuck with. You need to train because otherwise you're sort of putting someone at the helm of a fighter pilot jet, and they don't know which buttons do what, or if there are even buttons that control things.
yeah, I mean, upskilling your employees is so important. I mean, even if you're not embracing the cloud, making sure that your employees know what the current landscape looks like, making sure that they know the best methods for patching your machines or just running your machines, no matter what you're using,
Mm-hmm.
is vitally important. If you don't invest in your employees, that's how a lot of these vulnerabilities happen, is because people get lazy or they don't know what to look at. You end up with people getting promoted for just because of seniority rather than merit, and suddenly they're in charge of things that could potentially lead to breaches. And you just need to understand that these people need to, if you want to promote from seniority, that's fine, but it needs to be someone who's willing to learn and adopt the new role, and you need to be willing to invest in that employee.
Right. Talk a little about, maybe this is going backwards in the discussion, but talk a little about guest users because that's a fairly inexpensive, free means of accessing an Azure app or part of the platform. What do you feel about how that's controlled in terms of, if you have a high number or they're not properly secured or maybe they're not even being authenticated the right way? Are there issues around guest users that you're particularly concerned about on the
The biggest
platform?
issue that the biggest issue you're going to find with guest users is generally going to be your own misconfigurations. Guest users have you can configure their permissions like any other user in your environment, but all too often some people get lazy with their guest users. They'll tend to give someone guest user access, and when that guest user signs in for the first time, they find out that, hey, I can suddenly see this entire SharePoint page you've shared with me, and it's got a lot of documents in here that have things like company policies, contracts, and things of that nature. So you have to be careful about where you're giving guest access. If you give it at the root level of something, they're going to probably be able to get read access to at least a few things you don't want. The biggest thing with guest lists is just, maybe set schedule some type of job that runs and cleans up anything that hasn't been accessed in more than, say, like 30 or 60 days. Making sure that your guest permissions are all set so that they have minimal access. I know lately Teams has been pushing out things like being able to talk with guest users that you
Mm-hmm.
allow inside your organization.
Right.
I've played with that functionality a little bit out the box. It's pretty strict in terms of the Teams methodology, where if I give someone guest access, they only have access to the channel and the page, and users weren't able to upload or download anything that was on the SharePoint page that was attached to.
Mm-hmm.
But that could very easily get out of whack, because let's say that you start assigning, let's say that you use something like a dynamic group to put your guests in so that they can have permissions automatically assigned. Well, you want to make sure that you're auditing those permissions every now and again to make sure that it's not gained new access due to somebody putting somewhere it doesn't belong, making sure that maybe something didn't change. Because, we all know Microsoft loves to change things pretty much every hour. I'm pretty sure I'm going to log in later on today and the GUI is going to have something changed.
Right. Yeah, the cycles of development and releases are pretty fast. So, last thing I want to talk to you about is really the training paths. How does someone, you've dumped or informed an enormous amount in a short period of time, and obviously demonstrates where you are in terms of your knowledge is way at the top of the curve. But someone coming into this anew is now being bombarded by lots of things. What does someone do to get up the curve, to comfortably get up the curve, and really not feel like they're swimming in a deep ocean that they have no life preserver for?
I would encourage anybody to, first of all, take a step back and just remember, technologies these days, if you're trying to learn about it in any capacity, it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's immense. There's a lot to learn. So don't feel discouraged, first of all. But the first place I would encourage, at least from the Azure standpoint, or any cloud realistically, is to start with the fundamental certification path. You don't even have to get that certification, but if you just look over things like the exam guides, if you look over some of the information about how to get that certification, that's going to give you a good baseline into the technologies available to you on each cloud platform. Azure has the AZ900. AWS has the Certified Cloud Practitioner. GCP has the Digital Leader cert. And all three of those can give you a fantastic foundation to build on from there, because you can see which technologies you really kind of resonate with. You can see the things that you really enjoy working with, or maybe something just clicks and it's just easier for you to work with that technology. I know I started with the AZ900 before going for the AZ104. I'm getting and teaching the AZ204. There's a lot of good training out there as well. Once you have that foundation, there's a lot of good free resources out there. There are, of course, paid resources you can go with. But I would encourage anybody out there, start with that foundation layer. I don't care if you're a 10-year veteran in IT, getting that foundation layer under you and getting that foundation, even going so far as to get that foundation cert, shows that you have the capacity to learn. It shows that the certification in any of those areas can help you figure out, can help employers recognize that you have expertise and you're growing into the cloud. And finding those advanced level certifications can definitely help you start more towards a better path. And kind of go into that training path discussion, if you're a developer, there's a path for you. If you're a security person, there's a path for you. If you're a network guy, there's a path for you. I mean, networking has evolved, into software-defined networking in the cloud, and it was going that way for on-premise as well. So networking, you're going to find yourself right at home, and same with development. But the administrator mindset, I feel like, is the one that's shifted the most. And so if you're an administrator coming into cloud, I highly encourage you to look up, spend time on Microsoft Learn, spend time on AWS's training site, GCP's training sites. They are packed full of information that you need to know so that you can kind of shift your viewpoint on how you administrate machines day to day. And just make sure that you don't bring an on-premise first mentality to a cloud discussion. It's a whole argument, never bring a knife to a gunfight. Don't bring outdated methodologies to the table of the cloud, because the cloud is constantly changing. There are new services being created and updated in the cloud every single day. So it's a constantly changing landscape, and you have to be flexible with it.
Yeah, and we've just added all the certifications you just mentioned. We've added, I think, 90 hours in the past week worth of cloud training in the Azure space in particular, and hope to see you on the platform very shortly as well. And with that, Daniel, thank you for your insights and depth of knowledge and sharing that with everyone. Hope to see you again soon.
It's been a blast, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed talking about all this.